Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'm Johnny Detroit. This is Pregame.com. I am with the uncle of Pregame himself, Mr. Dave Essler. Dave, you there?
I am, Johnny.
All right, what we're going to do is if you have a question and you're logged in online, I know some of you are using the phone, there's a module. You could click a little button, ask a question. There's some questions via email I received, some in the forum, so I cannot guarantee that we're going to get to them all. Dave sent me a bunch of stuff that he wants to talk to. So we're going to get right into that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to say it out loud for those over the phone. Those watching on the screen will see what I'm talking about. I'm going to hand it over to Dave. The first thing Dave wanted to talk about was, and I love this, and not to sound like a fruit or anything, but I got excited. Excited about gambling, not excited about you per se, Dave, but
All right.
evolving. And you broke it down by month. In November, the transfers and coaching changes. December, travel, motivation, Christmas breaks. January, conference play begins. On and on and on. Go through each month, explain a little bit what you're talking about, and then if you have any specific examples or things either this season or in the past that you've used this to your advantage, I'm sure people would love to hear it. So start with November. I'm going to sit back and I'm going to listen. And once you're done with March, we'll go on to the next slide.
All right. Well, I don't like November, but we'll talk about it. November's always a tough month, not only because you're looking at what's obvious, the transfers, coaching changes, conference realignments, but this year you had the rule changes and teams falling to the bitter end. So I suffered about 15 one-point losses. But I think the mistake that I made in November, and a lot of people do, and I've heard Fezzik and others talk about it, is you have so many sports going on, and you just end up trying to do too much. And I did that in November, and you're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And then you just about think you got it figured out, but then December, you have all these tournaments that are played in all parts of the world. You had Oregon playing Georgetown and Japan, and you have games in Germany, and then you have Christmas break. So for someone like me, like I don't just plug in statistics and it spits out the winner. Um, a lot of what I do is situational, and it's just very difficult to get a really good pulse on a team until you get into January when you've got conference play and you've got a legitimate strength of schedule to look back on. You've got some history. Now, that was even a little tougher this year because of that conference realignment, but you've got a whole lot more data to go on. Um, if nothing else, you can look back at what happened last year when teams played each other. Um, for example, tomorrow UConn plays Louisville. Um, I try to look at, for me, how teams are playing right now. That's what I mean by evolve. It has to evolve constantly. Just something not just like football. How they playing this week, how they playing now, and right now, UConn seems to be getting some momentum. And look back at last year when Louisville really embarrassed them in stores. So I have to give the motivational edge to UConn. So I would like UConn. That would be an example. Um, then February, you get into a lot of conference rematches where teams are playing themselves for the second time this year. Um, one I would look at, and I did this strictly on your behalf, Johnny. February 5th, your Michigan Wolverines play Nebraska. And they struggled to beat Nebraska recently in Lincoln.
I actually watched that game. That was I like Nebraska in the points, and Michigan looked good, but Nebraska kind of pissed it away at the end. But like you said, they did struggle.
And so now I look at that rematch, and Nebraska is obviously going to have some confidence going into that. It's going to be Michigan at home, so they're going to be heavily favored. But 3 days after that rematch, Michigan's got to go travel to Iowa. So that would be a game I would look at already as semi-circled as a game I would think Nebraska would be getting enough points where I might look at it. barring an injury in the next 3 weeks or something stupid happens. I mean, you
Real
have to
quick,
be.
Dave, I just want to jump in with what you just said. And to me, what you just said is one of the things that's a big advantage for somebody who is either trying to specialize or has certain things that they look for. And, I know a lot of odds makers offshore. I've talked to guys that, have done odds in Vegas. And a lot of this stuff is going to be power ratings and basic numbers. And it's literally impossible for them for every single game with how many games they are. Even if college football they can't do it. Now look at college basketball when you have teams in the normal rotation like UAD or a lot of these small schools that aren't even in the college football one and they can't, know everything about every team. When you have little tidbits like this, and you're like you said, use your terminology, you're evolving throughout the season. What's going to happen is you take these little notes and you wait for these things to pop up. There is no way. The odds maker doesn't have 20, 30 guys on his staff. There's a couple guys with power ratings and, a couple things that maybe stand out, but it's all going to be power rating based. And they're not going to factor in, like you said, they didn't watch the Michigan-Nebraska game and say, you know what, in another month when they play each other, when we do this line, make sure that we remember this. There's like fucking 2,000 games across all sports between that game and when they play again. It's just not happening. So I loved what you said, and I just wanted to jump in and just point out that that's not something that's an opinion or a theory of yours. I know that works because I've talked to these guys, and for them it has to come down to math, and they can't do all these little trivial things like a guy like Dave Essler can for you. But continue, Dave.
Well, and that gets down to trying to do too much. I mean, you just said it. I mean, if you look at tomorrow's card, I don't know how many games there are, 150. I mean, you really got to stick to what you know. I mean, I've fallen into the classic trap lately of, I'll play 2 or 3 games out of 10 or 12 I like, and the 2 or 3 will not do as well as the other 8 or 9. And that gets annoying, and then you struggle with, well, maybe I'll just play them all. And, especially if you're selling your bets, you've had one bad day, and somebody's not going to be real happy. But that's a choice I got to make. But anyway, then you get into March, and March is interesting because you got teams that are looking for position for the postseason. A good example would be a Michigan State. They're probably going to be a 1 or a 2 seed because they always are, because Izzo will have them ready, although they have had some injuries lately. But I think they're not going to care about winning their conference tournament or having the best record. They're caring about March and where they're going to be playing and in what region.
And I agree. I totally agree with that. That's a great point.
You get a lot of teams that are in some of these sort of non-Big Ten conferences like the Pac-12, no disrespect, but they're the 5th-rated conference in a lot of places. And I guess people would kind of concede Arizona's probably going to win that, but Arizona really doesn't need to win that conference. But then you look at a lot of other teams, because when the selection committee starts looking at conferences, they're going to put a lot of weight on what conference they're in. And you've got teams like Cal and UCLA and Oregon and Stanford that really, really, really need to win. So there are going to be some sort of free money to be had when some of those teams are maybe catching a ton of points against a team like Arizona, because the game is just going to be do or die for UCLA or especially on the road. I mean, it's really hard for me to take road teams in conference play. And you could say the same thing about the SEC. They're rated even lower than the Pac-12. After Florida, right now, what teams are really automatically in? And don't even tell me Kentucky, because I think they're probably one of the most overrated teams once you take off Jabari. But you've got 4 or 5 other pretty good teams, and they're going to need to win going down the stretch. And that's when you get your upsets happening, because those power ratings, that's another thing that those power ratings just don't factor in. Who really needs to win and who really doesn't.
Well, Dave, I love the whole evolve thing, and the questions are coming in. I'm just telling you now, guys. We're going to power as much as we can into 30 minutes, but I can't guarantee getting out all the questions. So if you're waiting till towards the end, I can guarantee you're not going to get it in. So now we're going to move to weak and strong strength of schedule. And once again, not to sound like a Fruit Loop, is a friend of mine in Vegas. He did really well in the bowl games this year, and he historically does. And one of his strongest things that he looks at, and I don't know if you do this, but he looks at strength of schedule. A team that maybe has a great record or has a lot of hype around it, but if they play dog shit teams all year, a dog shit conference, and they're playing, say you got a 10-2 team from a mediocre conference playing a 6-6 team from the SEC, he looks at strength of conference or strength of schedule as something very important. And you gave me a couple teams, for example. So what I'm going to let you do is I'm going to let you go over those. I'll let you expand as needed. And then any tips or advice that you have for anyone listening now or who'll be listening on the archives once I upload these. So I'm going to sit back and let you go, Dave.
Well, I added a couple too, and there was one other thing I wanted to mention before we got to that real quick. Totals are a big deal, and this will be a classic. And I know you know this, but a lot of people don't. For example, in the early in the year when all these totals were going over, Kansas played Duke with a total of 159. They scored 177 points in that game. Books adjust. 4 of the next 5 Jayhawk games went under. Books adjust. 4 of the next 5 games went over. Books adjust. The game against Iowa State the other night stayed under. I mean, it's just, you got to watch those patterns. UNLV was the same way. Everybody knows them as the running rebels, so their totals are always chalk high coming out of the gate. 5 of their first 6 games stayed under. Books adjust. 7 of the last 8 have gone over. So, I think that's important. But as far as strength of schedule, I don't know which ones you're looking at because I'm not looking at the board. Indiana.
Yeah, the first one you had was Indiana, 317th, not experienced, turns the ball over.
Yeah, they turn the ball over, and they're seriously overvalued. I mean, I cannot for the life of me see them doing anything but what they did last night. Going forward, they're not. They get away from home. I just think they're grossly overrated. You look at who they've played, and every good team they played, they've lost to. They lost to UConn. They lost to Syracuse. They lost to Notre Dame. They lost to Illinois. They got crushed at home by Michigan State. So I kind of think that game against Wisconsin was a bit of an anomaly. I'd almost wonder if they cover tomorrow against Northwestern because they got to play Michigan State on Tuesday. So I think in Wisconsin, I think teams are just ultimately going to outshoot them. Where's my thing? Seton Hall.
Yep. 341st. They beat Providence in 2 OTs, and now 3 straight conference losses.
3 straight conference losses, but Seton Hall. They're Seton Hall. I think people still remember P.J. Carlissimo. I think they're overvalued. Georgia Tech, 333rd. They've lost to every decent team they played. They're now 1-3 in the ACC, and they were just completely mauled by Duke and completely mauled by Maryland. Another team that's close to your heart, and you'll probably be happy about this, Ohio State, 268. And now they've lost 3 straight conference games. I tend to think they're a bit of a paper tiger, too, based on the Ohio State of maybe a year or 2 or 3 ago when they had Sellinger and some of those other guys. Pittsburgh's another one. 284th strength of schedule. They played solid, but they've only played 2 true road games, and that was NC State and Georgia Tech. Didn't really impress me. They're small. I got a feeling Syracuse is going to put a whipping on them tomorrow in the Carrier. So you could go on and on and on about those kind of teams, but those were the first 4 or 5 that came to my mind. And conversely, I put a few teams down there that I think are undervalued. Eastern Michigan, a team you probably know real well. 6th ranked schedule in the nation. 22nd ranked defensive efficiency. If they could score at all, they'll roll through the back. So that's a team that I would look to back. I would look to back a team like Cal Poly, 10th toughest schedule in the nation. They played Arizona, they played Pitt, they played Stanford, they played Oregon. And now they're 3-0 in the Big West, and in actuality, they have a legitimate shot to win the Big West. And you win the Big West, you're in the Big Dance. So there's a team that's going to be seriously motivated, I would think, for the near future. I put Tulsa in that category. They're 5-9. People see 5-9. 67th toughest schedule. They beat Southern Miss, and they don't play Southern Miss again the rest of this season. They could win the Conference USA, and again win the Conference USA, and you're in the Big Dance. I have a little bit of concern with them because 4 of their last 5 games are on the road, and they got this kid Rashad Smith who's a little bit hobbled, but they're another team. That all gets back to strength of schedule and perception versus reality. There's a lot of these teams that have some, if you do look at numbers, some pretty bad numbers, but if you look at who they played, they probably should have bad numbers. So, yeah, I factor a whole lot into strength of schedule once you get past the sort of actual head-to-head type history.
Well, one of the things, and then moving on, and this is one of my favorite things, is futures. And the reason I always like futures, it's always futures in real big games, i.e. the Super Bowl, the national championship, where the public likes to see the bigger payoffs. Very rarely are you going to see somebody lock up money for a season and take Alabama to win the national championship. We had W over in the forums, with his big 400-1 on Auburn. It's dead now, but I took the Saints at 22-1. I didn't want to take the Broncos. I didn't want to lock up my money. So, and I love the last one, so I'll let you explain why taking 300-1 is a good value play. So you got Michigan State, Arizona, Syracuse, Wisconsin. You talked about a little bit of hedging if needed. So I'm going to hand it over to you before we get to the Q&A. And for everyone who's listening, we're going to have a coupon at the end to get half off Dave's best bet for Friday. I actually just loaded that before coming live.
Saturday.
For Saturday, I'm sorry. That coupon is going to be super, Dave. So, Dave, go ahead and go over some futures and some tips and advice what to do with these futures.
I think if you probably ask 10 people, you'd get 10 different answers. You'll get the people that are looking for the big payoff at 300 or 400-1, and odds are that's not going to happen. So I play futures almost with the intention of hedging eventually. If you bet Michigan State at 5-1, yes, they're the chalk right now. I'm not really sure they should be. I took Arizona at 7-1. Nick Johnson can carry a couple of freshmen, but they have a weakness. Every team has a weakness. Syracuse at 12-1, possibly weak because they're not all that deep, but when they get Coleman back, they might be. But if you look at all 4 of those teams have a absolute legitimate shot to be in the Final Four. At very worst, the Elite 8. So if you have a team like Michigan State at 5-1, when they get into the Elite 8 or the Final Four, they're going to be, 5-6 point favorite. So you're going to go back and hedge that with the other team's money line at plus 220 or plus 240, and you can just keep doing that game after game after game. I don't know how I can explain that any better. I know you understand what I'm talking about.
Well, and that's one of the good things about pregame is if what you said, if they need more clarification, you can go to pregamepros.com, click Dave's name, go right onto the page and ask him and Dave himself, because we have real people. Just it's not stock photos, and I'm not going to say any other sites names with that. So, Dave, is there anything else you want to talk to before we get to some of the Q&A and wrap this up?
No, I think throwing a little bit on Iowa at 30-1. I mean, you probably could have had them at a much better number, and that is probably a huge hedge opportunity. They're big and they're deep, but I'm just not sure about their non-conference schedule. We'll see how the Big Ten goes. I was a little leery. They gave up 93 points to Notre Dame, and what goes around comes around, and that'll happen again. But at 30-1, I had to, and my I was looking for this year's Florida Gulf Coast, and I threw Wisconsin Green Bay in there. And I might have put La Tech in there if they didn't lose Appleby. But those are just a couple that, I would throw a useless beer marble on. And, if they end up being next year's Florida Gulf Coast, well, then you really can make some money. But, those kind of bets aren't necessarily to, recoup all of November's losses as much as, there's an intent with those exactly for what it says, for the future, to do something with it. I mean, I can think of very few futures bets I've ever made that I've actually just let ride out. And some people would argue, then why would you bet it? Well, we could argue that for another hour.
And I agree. I had the Saints at 22-1, and if they would have made it to the conference championship or to the Super Bowl, I wouldn't have let it ride. I would have locked in a little bit on that conference championship game, to make something. And then if they went to the Super Bowl, because I had a dime on it, 22,000 is a lot of money. And I just felt at 22-1, they went, get a little bit into the playoffs. Like you said, it gives me some money to play with. And, I was wrong, but it felt good. They won that first game against Philly. I was playing poker and I was getting really, really excited. So real quick, we're going to get to some questions.
Well, what would you do with 22 grand?
Probably I would have hedged out and probably took 10 grand of it.
I think the only question I have for you is, would you have told your wife you had 22 grand?
Actually, I would have took your old lady to Punta Cana, and I through the Disney trip that we're going on in May on the Amex Gold, I would have used that money to pay for it, not tossed it on the Amex and had not used cash out of the bank account. First question, we got Bill Gibson. He wants to know, is there a number that you always fade? I've always thought that 5.5 was a number that indicated an active dog. I'll let Dave go, but I just want to jump in and say I saw some discussion about this in the forums, and I can tell you that there is really no number that I've ever seen, and I'll run the math. If you want to make a post, Bill, in the forums and shoot me an email at Johnny at Pregame, I'll come in and give you the actual data and run the numbers. But it's all short term. Like, there's this discussion that road favorites minus 4.5, 5, and 5.5. If you blanket fade, how good they're doing. They're like, you would have won like 6 of your 8 games or some shit this, or something like 70% of like 15 games this year. But I went back 400 games and it's 50-50. So if anything, you should probably start fading it because it's going to start balancing out. There's no real number that's an instant fade. I'd be shocked when I pull this data if that's true. Dave, if you disagree, jump in. But I just think, most gamblers see something short term and they think or they make themselves believe why it makes sense. And then a lot of people will post and everyone just assumes it's the truth. But when you dig into the raw numbers, I always use this line, 2 + 2 = 4, whether you want it to equal 5 or not. In the end, the math's going to tell you the truth.
Oh, I would tend to agree with that. I don't have a number that's an auto fade. I mean, I think years ago you might have been able to do that, but not anymore. What I will tell you is that, I play a lot of money line plays personally. I think last night maybe, it almost became like the NFL. I think they were, of the top 15 games, every single favorite that won covered, and there were only 3 or 4. And every single underdog that covered won. That sort of 6 to 9 point underdog. Those are the teams I look for that can win outright, and they usually do. I mean, it's a staggering number. If you go down the list tomorrow, blindly, if you took 50 of those 6 to 9 point underdogs tomorrow, I bet you would make money if you took them on the money line. But no, I don't have a number. I mean, the only number I would mess with, in the marquee games where you have, Ohio State and Michigan, and it's 2 or 2.5, that might matter, but the number matters less. I think the higher it goes, if that makes sense.
Always, everything you say makes sense, Dave. Next question comes from Scotty Dog.
Yeah.
What handicapping?
He's smart. He's sharper than I
am. Well, I think he wanted you to say that because he refers to himself as an amateur in this, which he clearly isn't if you read his post. What handicapping trap or traps do you find yourself continuously falling into, and what do you see us amateurs falling into more times than not? One of the ones that I fall into more often than not, and I've just told myself to blanket not do it. I don't really have the true math upon it, but it kind of always happens this way, is when I get something from somebody or offshore or whatever it is, and I line shop, and I'll see, say, a game. We'll just use fake names, for example. We'll say Michigan's playing Northwestern in basketball, and they say take Michigan, and I see some credit shops that I know take sharp action and are, just as sharp, if not sharper, than your Chris's and whatnot out there. And you'll see a Northwestern +5, like -115, and Michigan -105. I always tell myself, no matter what, if you see these look like magic games that certain places like a Pinnacle or a Grande or the sharper head count places are weighting the juice, used to be called the Pinnacle lean back in the day when Pinnacle took US action, or if you would see like a total and they'd have -112 and the comeback like +103, you would know to blanket bet the over everywhere. When I see these places weight the line or the juice, I tell myself, don't fucking bet it, and I always bet it, and it seems like I always lose. Dave, what traps do you fall into, and what are some tips for amateurs that you would say that you just need to avoid?
The trap I fall into is probably the same trap, amateurs, professionals alike fall into. It's really just a question of not falling into it too terribly often. Is seeing what you want to see. You look at a game and you go, I just know they're going to win, and then you'll do your homework and go, well, maybe they're not. But you'll make the data say what you want it to say to justify your bet, when in the back of your mind there's always something telling you don't do it. I do that more often than I would like to admit to, but I do it, and I think a lot of people do that. And the other trap is, probably getting out of your comfort zone. Scotty Dog's very good at what he does, and he sticks to the West Coast stuff. And, he does very well at it, but he also knows, well, I'm not going to play games in the SoCon because I don't even know who's in the SoCon. And that's really hard for people to do. And he does a great job of it, and I would be the first one to admit that occasionally I'll get out of my comfort zone and go, I really think, and I'll really make that case, instead of sticking with what you know. And, if that's 2 games out of 120, so be it. 2-0 is better than 2-3 trying to justify something that you really have no business justifying. I mean, it's human nature.
I 100% agree. We got time for one more question. I just want to get this up here for everybody. Dave's going to have a triple star college basketball game of the week that's on his pros page right now. Tested the coupon, and once Dave confirmed it was up and loaded, coupon code SUPERDAVE is going to take 50% off. Once we're done with this, I'm going to upload this to YouTube. I'll have it posted on the forum if any part of this you want to go over. I'm sure a lot of guys are going to want to go over those futures, guys who maybe are on the phone and didn't listen or get to see the PowerPoint itself. So I'll have this up and loaded. We got time for one more question. I'm going to let Dave answer it. Let Dave give a final thought. I'm going to have one more thing to say, and then we're going to close out. This one comes from one of my favorites, Jeff Scott. Jeff wants to know, first he does the usual ass kiss, and hi, Dave, thanks for taking the time to do this. That's how Jeff sounds, too, by the way. Just kidding, Jeff. My biggest question is, how do you handicap on big card days? And that's something all the webinars, I think, at one point or another, we've touched on. And I've heard the pros say, like you just said, specialize. If Scotty Dog's good at a certain conference on a Saturday when there's a godly amount of games, you can't do them all. So what do you do, Dave? I mean, you do this and have more time than the average guy in the forums. This is, what you do. A Saturday, a boatload of games. It's literally impossible to break down every single one of them. I know you don't want to give away all your secrets, and this is the last question before we close it up. What are some things that Dave Essler does on a big college basketball day?
I start right at the top of the rotations, and I'll cross off games I know absolutely nothing about, and I will circle games that, basically what I'll do is before the lines come out, and that goes with evolving and being prepared. Like you kind of, when you're doing Wednesday, you kind of got to look at Saturday for look ahead. So you kind of got a bunch of leads, but I'll go down the list and I will go, well, Missouri's on the road. They always suck at home. That's a possibility. I mean, very fundamental. And I'll just continue to go down that list as the public perception. And I'll go down that list, Miami is playing at Georgia Tech tomorrow. Well, the consensus is Miami isn't what they used to be last year, but I tend to think maybe they are, so I would circle Miami because I think they'll probably be a solid. I'll just go down the list and teams I absolutely know, and you usually find 15 or 20 of them that you almost know what you would do.
Right.
And to me, it'd be that team or nothing, and then it just becomes process of elimination. And then having too much time can also be a curse, because I will have too much time and I will have made a lot of bets, and I'll go back and I'll go, I really do think I should look at Montana versus Eastern Washington, and rather than just try to drum up Scotty Dog, I'll try to justify it. That's wrong.
See, Scotty Dog, you're not an amateur. That's what you wanted. You wanted me and Dave to come and say how awesome. Well, you're awesome, Scotty Dog. Well, Dave Essler is clearly, if you've listened to any of the webinars, followed him on the forums, read his analysis. One of the reasons we like to do these and have the guys interact with you guys in the community is because you can call bullshit if you need to, and I don't think anyone who listens to Dave speak, reads his analysis, or watches his posts in the forum or his rants on Twitter to not think that this cat does not know his shit when it comes to college basketball. We've got a couple days left. You could lock in Dave, the NBA, college basketball, NBA combo, all the way through the completion of the Final Four in the NBA Finals. And don't forget, Super Dave coupon, 50% off his college basketball game of the week. Make sure you take advantage of that. I want to say thanks for everyone who took the time to listen. I want to say thanks for everyone who's going to be watching and listening to this in the archives. And most of all, I want to say thanks to Dave Essler for taking time out of his busy schedule and away from some important family time to spend 30 minutes with us. So on behalf of Pregame.com, I'm Johnny Detroit. He's Dave Essler. That's going to do it. As always, from me to you, best of luck.